What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to the Cutlass Board Games channel. I'm Keith and I make games for a living, and that is why I'm always very interested when there is rules discourse around Magic the Gathering. The rule in particular that has been talked about a little bit on Twitter is the Legend rule. Saffron Olive came out with this tweet kind of expressing his feelings about how things have changed over time with the Legend rule, and especially because the upcoming Spider-Man set is mostly legendary creatures, that maybe is it time for the Legend rule to change. But let's kind of talk about it. I want to go through some of the Twitter crowd knee-jerk reactions to this claim that the Legend rule should change, because there's always going to be people that are like, there's nothing wrong with it, it doesn't need fixing. But there is sometimes going to be a nuanced take that will give us, some things to kind of discuss. So let's start there. Saffron Olive tweets, I think it might be time to drop the Legend rule as a gameplay mechanic. It has already changed many times, each making it less meaningful. Seems like the next step is to drop it altogether and just use Legendary to mean legal as Commander and important to the story. Follow-up. I think having Legendary be a gameplay mechanic made sense in the past when there were few Legends and it could be used to balance cards, but in the current era where most creatures are Legends in some sets, it's just a random drawback for constructed with no real purpose. And that does kind of make sense where, because Commander has grown so much and people want the ability to use their favorite guy as their commander. And so the Legend rule is a requirement for it to be a commander. And so whenever they're printing these cool, powerful cards like VV, they want it to be legendary so that people can use it for commander and so that people can use their favorite guy in their favorite format. And so formats like Standard suffer, and more specifically, formats like Legacy will suffer the most. And I will get into that in a little bit later on. And I know Wizards doesn't give a shit about Legacy, but some of the cry is going to be from that crowd. So let's head on to our next slide, shall we? This is the Trinket Mage. This is another YouTuber who I actually think is kind of based. I've seen some of their videos, and I think they do kind of pop off a little bit. And so they said, I've seen some talk about removing the Legendary rule. We should not do that. It's a game mechanic for a reason. You can make cards with abilities that stack in multiples and not have to worry about it being too strong. This is a tool for card design and we should not remove it. And the example that was attached to this tweet is Dahlia, Guardian of Thraben, which we will talk about a little bit in a second. And this makes sense. The Legend rule exists for a reason, and some cards are really requiring that kind of one-of sentiment. I have a slide coming up where I will talk about some specific offenders that were highlighted during this discourse, and we can kind of see why they exemplify the argument to not change the Legend rule, but we'll get to that. There's one last one that I want to talk about. I thought this one was interesting because this is a reply to a tweet where they're basically like, why should only people that care about Commander be able to affect the rules for all the other formats because they're a Legacy player. And the reply to that was, this doesn't even have anything to do with Commander. He was complaining about trying to build Spider-Man decks for Standard, and a huge percentage of the set is legendary creatures. This change would barely impact Commander at all, which I disagree with, but we'll get to that later. The reason every set has 4 billion legendary creatures for no fucking reason is because the grey goo that is Commander has consumed the whole game. And I think this is a kind of a pertinent point, because there's a weird relationship between these two spaces where the new cards being made, which go into Standard first, and there's a whole different argument for whether Universes Beyond should do that or not, but those sets, especially based on IP, are going to have a large amount of legendary creatures because they're key characters to the story. At a baseline, that makes sense. Wizards is heavily more incentivized to make those be legendary creatures because that is what your commander requires, and Commander being the most played format, they want as many guys to be played in format to encourage you to be playing Commander. So there's kind of a 22 problem here where things that happen in Standard directly and always will affect Commander, and Commander is now more actively affecting Standard. So, should the Legend rule be changed? Well, what does the Legend rule mean for Commander? The Legend rule in Commander doesn't matter. You're not going to have multiple copies of the same card in your deck where you're worried about it being stuck in your hand and you can't play it because you already have one in play. The only time when you're worried about stuff like that happening in Commander is if you're making clones and copies of something, and there's already plenty of good utility for Irenicus's Vile Duplication, which creates a copy of something that's specifically not legendary. So if Commander doesn't give a shit about the Legend rule in the same way that constructed formats like Legacy do, why should constructed formats face the penalty in the same way? So let's dig into that a little bit, because these are the big offenders, I think, for why the Legend rule should not change. Let's start with Thalia, because I think Thalia was a good shout. Thalia is from a really specific design space. There is a really old card called Sphere of Resistance. It is a artifact. It costs 2 colorless, and it says spells cost 1 more to cast. All right? It's at the same cost level as Thalia. It has a similar effect, but the reason why Thalia is both a creature and legendary, it's duplicating this effect, but it serves a purpose to protect creature-heavy decks from high interaction decks. So Lightning Bolt now costs 2, and that makes it really hard for them to cast multiple different things, unless if they kill Thalia first, which is also kind of a hose for Storm and stuff like that. And Hate Bears in general, there is a lot of good legendary Hate Bears with effects that you do not want to be stacking, kind of because of this reason. Next is Mox Opal. Are you shocked? This card kind of broke Modern every time it's been available. It's way too powerful. And the first time it was in Modern, when it was in Affinity, it was still played as a 4-of, and you would have your Metalcraft, you would play the Mox Opal, you would make a mana, you would play your second Mox Opal, destroying their tapped first one, and then you'd play your third Mox Opal to make a second mana, and then cast your 2-drop on the first turn. And that was pretty good at the time. That was really fast for Modern. And they changed the Legend rule, where you just get +1 mana every single time you play a Mox Opal now, which is kind of crazy. And then if they just remove the Legendary rule, this is just a Moxen. You just play 3 of them. You just replace 4 lands with 4 Mox Opal, and that's it. That's your deck. You don't need anything else. It can just activate itself with Metalcraft. That's crazy. And so a change like this, removing the Legend rule, would disproportionately destroy Legacy. Now, there are gates in place for some formats for this problem. Vintage has restricted cards. A lot of the problem legendaries could become restricted cards where you can only play 1 in the deck, and therefore the Legend rule basically means you're not going to have more than one of these unless if you make a clone copy of it. Which, isn't that crazy? I think that's fine, right? I don't think that's too insane. But then Legacy, one of the big decks at the moment is an Emery deck, where you're playing lots of artifacts, you're playing lots of Thoughtcast, and Mox Opal becoming way more powerful is just really bad in general. And so I don't recommend that. I think Legacy is the format that will be impacted the most. And some other cards that were mentioned, like Tabernacle of Pendril Vale, which is a land. And one of the most powerful decks in Legacy is lands, where you're playing, it's like 40 lands, and they're all just utility lands, and you're trying to kill them with Marit Lage or something like that. And basically, part of the Pendril Vale's downside is that you can only have 1 of them in play, because it gives each creature an upkeep cost where, unless if they pay 1, it gets destroyed. And so things that don't have haste really suffer, and people that are trying to play a lot of creatures, people trying to do stuff like play Hate Bears, suddenly have to pay this huge tax just to keep their guys around, and that's pretty brutal. So having 2, 3, 4 of them in play, kind of insane, actually. Kind of very, very broken. And then a slightly different argument for the same kind of purpose is the channel lands from New Kamigawa. Because the reason why these are so played in Commander is because you don't suffer from the legend rule. You can just play it as a one-off, and it's a really good utility, or it just basically is an island, or it is a forest in the case of Boseiju. Boseiju really highly played. I just like this one more. Now, in constructed formats, you go, well, I'm going to play Legacy Merfolk. My land base is 4 Otawara, Island, Cavernous Souls, Mutavault. What do I... what's the downside to me just playing 4 uncounterable bounce channel abilities? Which is kind of what I really liked about these specific lands, where you go, okay, I can play the first one as a land, and then if I have a second one in my deck, I can't play it as a land, but it becomes a utility thing where I will already have a couple land in play, and I can use it for its ability instead, which is really cool from a deck building design choice. Am I just playing one on the off chance that I have to use the ability? Am I going to play a second one because I will probably be playing it as a land anyway? And I think that kind of stuff is pretty interesting, is pretty cool with how the legend rule is supposed to work. Now, let's talk a little bit more about Commander, because Commander turns a legendary downside into an upside. However, legendary is a requirement for Commander play. This is kind of echoing back to what I mentioned before, but because Commander is a singleton format, you will not have a second copy of a legendary spell in your deck, and so you are not worried about that downside. Changing things for standard formats to accommodate a thing that Commander is completely agnostic about, Commander doesn't notice, doesn't see at all, kind of defeats the purpose. But it must have legendary on it to be a requirement for Commander play. You cannot play it as your Commander unless it has legendary written on it. And so rather than completely fucking up constructed formats, why don't you change the rules to Commander, where you can just play any creature as your Commander? It doesn't have to be legendary. Why does it have to be legendary? Is there a specific reason? If we were playing Commander with the old legend rule and someone else was playing the same Commander as I, and we just can't have them on the field at the same time because they both go to the command zone, so whoever plays it first gets it for a turn, and then it's just gone forever, never played again. What's the interactive purpose of that? What is the point of the legend rule existing at all in Commander? And so then why is it a requirement for it to be your Commander, besides denoting that it is an important story character? Do we really give a shit? Does that matter at all, actually? Probably not. So then why don't you just change the rules to Commander to change the requirements for what can be a Commander, rather than just destroy every constructed format with this important design limiting tool like Trinket Mage pointed out? And so that's kind of my vibe here. Commander, which has a stranglehold over Wizards of the Coast because it's their primary format for play, because they've already killed every other constructed format basically with not supporting it, not giving it enough reason to breathe, not banning VV in a hurry. And so then what? Then Commander just dictates why we're getting 1,000 Universes Beyond, why we're getting 1,000 different legendary creatures to make standard an unplayable format. It is already deeply unplayable. I've seen tweets of people being like, yep, I went to my local, there was 3 people there, and then I went to another local and there was not enough people for it to fire anyway. I can't even play this game because there's no events going, because no one wants to play with VV in the format. And it's going to wait till the ban, and then they'll come back. And standard is dead, right? And then if Commander is the only thing left, and Commander is the thing that is dictating what all of the new releases are going to be for a rule that it doesn't care about, that seems like a problem with how things are designed. Now, the main argument for keeping the legendary rule in constructed formats is that the legendary rule prevents players from having 3 VVs in play. Now, one of them is very strong, and the legend rule does a good job at you having a strong character and not just duplicating them, because one VV with a few counters on it can just play a second VV with the mana that he generates. And also, what happens to cards like Mirror Box and stuff that says the legendary rule does not apply? Then what? What do? They just become obsolete? They become useless? How can we change the legend rule? I think there's a few thoughts. for what people want out of this. I think the main thing is that in Standard, if you're going to have 100 legendary creatures and that's your deck, that you don't want to be stuck holding a bunch of the same guy. Now, Spider-Man in particular, with all the legendary creatures, they have web slinging. So there's nothing stopping you from casting one with web slinging and returning the same legendary creature, so they're not in play at the same time, and getting an extra entrance effect for cheaper, which it's not perfect. You would rather a second different guy if possible, but it's not horrible. And I think it's difficult to really complain about something looking forward. We haven't seen the Spider-Man set for long enough to be able to go, wow, this has fucked the game entirely. So it feels a little early to complain that the legend rules should change because of the legendary saturation within the set. But if we were to change the legend rule, let's say it's pressed upon me, Wizards reaches out and they go, Keith, you're a genius. I need you to solve this problem for me. What do I do? Well, what are the problem cards? Mainly the complaint is about creatures. People think the legend rule doesn't work as well for creatures, but then all the people complaining that the legend rule should remain cite artifacts and lands: Tabernacle of Pendrell Vale, Otawara, Boseiju, Mox Opal. I think some of the biggest offenders. As for creatures, maybe it's not that crazy. Maybe it would be fine if we had 3 VVs. Probably not. But I think some of the other stuff is more broken because of how you use those resources is different. You have to make a conscious choice to play out a second VV. And so, well, what do we do to change the legend rule? And also, what does removing it entirely achieve? I think removing it entirely is bad. I think that would not be great, and I think that changing it would be better. Removing it entirely only affects constructed formats, and formats like Vintage can use something like the restricted rule to clamp down on stuff like Mox Opal being too powerful. And that's kind of great. But the problem here is you're asking for a rule to be changed, and you are asking Wizards to closely monitor formats for how egregiously this huge change will affect the game. Do you know how many legendary creatures exist? Do you know how many legendary things exist in the game already, and you expect them to hand comb through all of them and adjust the ban lists for Legacy, for Vintage, according to this rule change? You really think that's a thing that's going to happen? Probably not. Probably not. So I really doubt it's going to be removed entirely. But, say for sake of argument, I have to come up with something silly. What would I do? If the main concern is having a card in your hand, specifically a creature that does nothing, that will have no effect until the first creature dies, then instead of removing the legendary rule, we should change the legendary rule to maybe something like this. This, in particular, is a more silly take at the idea, but basically this is somewhere between the new legend rule and the old legend rule, where if you have a legendary creature in play and you have a legendary creature in hand with the same name, then that card in your hand gains this text. It becomes an instant, maybe like an adventure or something, and you may cast it at instant speed, and it says destroy target legendary permanent with the same name as this card. And so the card in your hand does something now. The card in your hand would destroy someone else's Spider-Man. That does the same thing. Or blow up your own Spider-Man if someone's going to destroy it in a way that gains them a bunch of life, or something like that. I think instead of removing the legend rule, and specifically because the complaint is about creatures in particular, then perhaps having a second copy of it should add something. It should do something new and different, which gives it value, gives it a purpose for it to be, for more reason for you to play it, instead of removing something that is a gate, that is a safeguard that we rely on to keep a lot of other formats balanced. And then in Commander, this isn't going to come up. This is never going to matter. This is never going to be a problem. So you should not be compromising on constructed formats to not change Commander in any way. I don't understand. We're going to have a lot of legendary creatures. That's going to happen no matter what because Commander demands it of us. But constructor formats shouldn't suffer because of that. And I think adding rather than subtracting is the way to solve this problem. But I'm curious, what do you think? Did you have a cool solution to the legend rule? Do you think it should just go entirely? Or did I change your mind and make you think that maybe it's fine? Or maybe something cool and new could come out of it? I'm always curious to know what people are thinking about, especially with this game because it's so big and complicated. People love arguing about it all the time because there's a lot of interesting different ways where we can maybe consider it. Maybe everyone's favorite game could change for the better one of these days. And I don't know, I'm always thinking about it. I'm always curious.